Good noon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in the world who is joining us for the UNCTAD e-commerce week session. We are very happy to have you here with us today, as we're going to have a very exciting, shall we say, very insights, research-based, rich discussion on the role of e-commerce companies and what they play towards data and digitalization for development, especially how data governance and ethics supports data and digitalization for development. To give you a brief context on what this work is all about and who we are from the World Benchmarking Alliance. My name is Lourdes Montenegro. I lead our digital sector transformation work. At the World Benchmarking Alliance, we are a global initiative operating as a nonprofit. And our mission is really to ensure that the private sector do their fair share, that they contribute to the achievement of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And through our global consultations, we realized that the digital sector is actually very important and plays a very important role. Digital technologies are considered to be cross-cutting enablers of the achievement of sustainable development. But to make that happen, to ensure that we can get all the good benefits from digital technologies, we need to ensure that the process of digitalization, that the process of digital transformation is indeed inclusive, leaving no one behind, bringing all of us along, and that it is trustworthy, that risk and harms to individuals and to society are minimized. Over the years since 2020, we have been publishing a free and publicly available corporate benchmark. So it ranks and scores. This benchmark is called the Digital Inclusion Benchmark. It ranks and scores 200 of the world's most influential digital technology companies. And you will hear more about how that benchmark is set up and what are the different measurement areas later on. But the key thing is that this data is meant to empower you all, stakeholders who are here listening to this webinar, with insights, with analyses, with the tools to help you along your advocacy for data and digitalization for development. So we encourage you all to check out the benchmark results, check out the insights report. My colleagues will be sharing it in the chat. You will find analyses and data on 150 of these technology companies that we have assessed so far. By 2023, we will be already assessing 200 of these companies. So feel free to cite and use that in your own advocacies. So the data, in our view, is just data unless all of our stakeholders use that. So that is just meant to empower everyone in the community, whether you are a civil society organization working on these different issues, whether you are from government and trying to understand how your policies are working, whether you are investors who are looking at the performance of your different companies, and whether you are a company trying to understand how your performance could be improved or based on what other best practices there are in the industry. So please feel free to use this data and results, download the insights report. It's very rich with data tables and analyses that is very unique and you will not find elsewhere. And before I go and mumble on, I would like to introduce my colleague, Michael Minguez. Michael leads the research for the Digital Inclusion Benchmark. And Michael will take us through the findings for 18 e-commerce companies that are assessed and ranked and scored in this Digital Inclusion Benchmark. And again, we encourage everyone, all the attendees, to please jump in and ask questions in the chat. Feel free to do that, and I will read your questions and address it to Michael. Michael, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lourdes. As Lourdes mentioned, I'm the research lead for the digital inclusion benchmark. Could we share the slides, please? So I'd like to welcome you all to this session on assessing digital platforms and their data governance and ethics. Next slide, please. So as Lourdes said, the World Benchmarking Alliance assesses companies on different aspects, and one of the benchmarks is on digital inclusion. And it's the largest tech company benchmark in the world. And we look at 4 areas: access, skills, use of digital technologies, and innovation. And the 3rd and 4th are what areas are what I'll be discussing today, because digital governance, data governance, it goes to use and mitigating risks, making the internet more trustworthy, and ensuring ethical innovation. Next slide, please. So there's 150 of the largest tech companies in the world in the benchmark. The circles show their headquarters location, but their reach goes much further than that, into over 175 economies through the sale and use of their products and services. Next slide, please. And in terms of the digital platforms, we look specifically at the case of e-commerce companies. In the wider sense, digital platforms could also include social media companies or streaming services. But again, we keep it focused on e-commerce companies. So we look at 18 of the largest e-commerce companies in the world. They include global players like Alibaba and Amazon, as well as regional players like Mercado Libre, which is active in Latin America, and national players such as Gojek in Indonesia. And it includes both retail e-commerce companies, mainly selling products, as well as services such as booking holdings or ride-hailing and food delivery companies. Next slide, please. So UNCTAD came out with a press release a couple days ago looking at the top 13 e-commerce companies, and we include 10 of those 13 in our benchmark. And I think what's striking is it shows the impact of COVID-19. If you look at 2019 to 2021, you can see how much the e-commerce sector, B2C e-commerce, has grown, but also a bit worryingly, how the larger companies such as Alibaba, Amazon, JD.com have grown even more and are just continue to get bigger and bigger. Next slide, please. So we have 4 indicators in the benchmark that are related to data governance. One is whether the company has high level commitment to information security, whether the company monitors, operationalizes protection of information, whether it applies responsible practices for personal data, and if it has ethical guidelines for its research and development and product use. Next slide, please. So turning to that first indicator, some of the things we look at is whether the company has a high level commitment to cybersecurity, whether it has a chief information security officer, whether there's a committee overseeing information security, and whether it documents how information security is handled within the company. And if you look at the chart, no company gets the highest score here of 2. And overall, the average for the e-commerce companies is just 0.33 out of a scale of 2, compared to all other companies where it's 0.73. Next slide, please. Then we look at how the company operationalizes cybersecurity. So does it have a security incident response team? Does it have international certification for its information security management? Does it disclose the number of data breaches, an indicator of transparency? And all of these operational elements are critical to protect and respond to security incidents, but also to instill greater trust among users. And again, turning to the e-commerce companies, Gojek, which is an Indonesian ride-hailing company, but it gets a perfect score of 2. Gojek just merged with Tokopedia, which was the largest retail e-commerce company in the country. So now it's called Go2. All of the other companies, except for 3, do get some level of scoring on this indicator, but still there's big room for improvement. Next slide, please. And then we look at the company's practices for personal data. Does it consider data privacy a high-level issue? Does the company have a group privacy policy? So what do we mean by a group privacy policy? That its data privacy is the same across the world, ideally, that users shouldn't be discriminated against in one country compared to another country. So why is that? Because, for instance, I'm in Europe, and the EU has a general data privacy regulation, which is very stringent. And so all companies have to modify their privacy practices according to this European standard. But somebody in another country outside the EU might then have much lower levels of privacy protection accorded to them, particularly if there's not a national regulation, or if the national regulation is weak. And so that really discriminates against users. So ideally, companies should have a race to the top on data privacy and apply the most stringent and secure measures that favor the user and protects their data. And then we also look at whether the company publishes a transparency report about how many government requests it gets for user data. So in terms of the results, no e-commerce company gets a perfect score. Naspers is the highest, but again, e-commerce companies on average perform worse than the other tech companies in the benchmark. Next slide, please. Finally, we look at artificial intelligence and whether the company has a set of principles it follows for ethical artificial intelligence, and whether it makes those publicly available. I mean, why is this important? Because so many companies now, I mean, virtually every tech company uses AI, and it can be biased. It can take away from users' autonomy. It can be misused by suppliers to the company. So it's really critical that companies explain how they use AI and how they operationalize it. In the benchmark as a whole, there were actually only 20 companies out of 150 that had published ethical guidelines. But none of the e-commerce companies do, and this is really a serious weakness that needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. So as a whole, looking at the whole benchmark, you can see that the e-commerce companies are underperforming. They score just 21 out of 100 compared to the average for all other companies. And the highest ranked e-commerce company is Naspers, only at 39th. And indeed, most of them rank over 100. So again, there's lots of room for improvement among e-commerce companies. Next slide, please. Yeah, I threw this slide in because we're also working on a climate project with the International Telecommunications Union. So this is the climate performance of the e-commerce companies. If you look at GHG emissions, you can see that Amazon and Alibaba have far higher emissions than all the other companies. And it's partly because they also operate a lot of data centers for their cloud services. And in terms of renewable electricity, none of them has reached 100%. The highest is eBay at 74. And when they want to become carbon neutral, ranges from Booking Holdings reports that it already is to the year 2040. One thing to notice is the opaqueness that about half these companies don't report any climate data, and even on some of the other indicators that I was discussing before, there's 4 or 5 that don't disclose any information. So that's another barrier that needs to be addressed by these companies. Next slide, please. So the e-commerce companies are lagging compared to other tech companies. The performance is particularly poor in the area of data governance and ethics, and stakeholders, governments, investors, the public, civil society should really be encouraging these companies to follow best practice for data governance and ethics to improve their performance and to instill greater trust among users. Next slide, please. So this is just where you can get some of the information that was covered today. We have an insights report, the benchmark results in a spreadsheet for all 150 companies. But also, the digital companies were assessed in terms of their social performance, and this includes things like human rights, labor, tax policy, and a lot of these are really relevant to e-commerce companies because, for instance, like ride-hailing and food delivery companies, they don't consider the people that are delivering the food their employees. They consider them as self-employed, so they may have less stringent labor policies for them, and that's proven to be controversial in some countries, as well as tax policy is a critical issue because a lot of these companies are operating virtually, and they may not be paying their fair share of taxes in the companies where they are doing business, even though they don't have a physical presence. So I really encourage you to have a look at the benchmark report because there's a whole chapter on some of the core social aspects of digital businesses. So thank you very much for your attention. And if there's any questions or follow-up, please let me know.
Thanks very much, Michael, for that very detailed discussion. And I would actually like to encourage everyone who are attending this webinar in person and not viewing it later to feel free to talk and ask to be unmuted. We'd like it to be a very interactive discussion. So if you have thoughts, if you have comments, you have ideas, especially as it relates to the findings that you have just listened to, please feel free to raise your hand or just say you want to talk or just put your questions in the chat if you're a bit shy. So that's also okay. But maybe to just to fire off this conversation, because e-commerce companies are really a very fascinating set of companies within the whole digital ecosystem. So our work actually covers a range of companies from A to Z. We call them Adobe to ZDE, the A to Z of the digital sector. And we have these 18 e-commerce companies, and it's actually fascinating listening to Michael that I just realized that it isn't about is it about size, Michael? I mean, does the size of the e-commerce company matter in their performance around data governance and ethics? We seem to see a pattern of different sizes, companies coming from developed and developing countries. Do we see a difference in that? Because the policymakers listening in might actually be interested in the differences between the developed country e-commerce companies who are headquartered in developed countries and those who are headquartered in developing countries. Do we see a pattern from the data?
Somewhat. I mean, if you look at the top ranked companies in the different indicators, Naspers, for instance, it's a South African sort of holding company of many e-commerce companies around the world and food delivery companies. It performs pretty well. Gojek that I mentioned also does. The larger global companies such as Amazon tend to do a little bit above average, and I think that's partly to do because there's more focus on them from their investors for them to improve their ESG performance. But then again, at the other extreme, the companies that don't report and disclose tend to be privately held companies operating in developing countries. So it's quite a bit of difference there.
Interesting. So what we're actually seeing from the data is that the good performance on data governance and ethics is not necessarily concentrated on the large, big platforms that are headquartered in the developed countries, especially in North America, for example. What we're seeing is a range of different levels of performance, and from the data we can even say that the big e-commerce platforms that are headquartered in the developed countries are underperforming relative to what we see from companies in the global south. So that's actually quite fascinating that we see smaller e-commerce platforms in terms of their revenue, perhaps, or their market capitalization, doing a lot better, and perhaps that's also something that we need to pay attention to. It's just unfortunate that the speaker from GoTo was unable to join us due to a last-minute engagement, but it would have been interesting to understand from an e-commerce perspective how they're able to do that, given their relative scale when they are being compared against giants, for example, like Amazon. So that's really pretty fascinating. Another question to you, Michael. Just wondering, why do we think the e-commerce companies are behind? It's really, they're really very behind in terms of performance, not just in data governance and ethics, which is in a way concerning because their main business is really the data that comes from retail trade online, and we are not, they're still a bit behind from the other sectors. Why do you think that is?
The key factor is their age. Most of them are young companies founded in the last 10 to 20 years, and it takes a while to build up that, I think, corporate responsibility and commitment to doing good. And many of these companies, I mean, a lot of them, have only become publicly listed in the last few years, and the focus has always been on their shareholders rather than the wider stakeholders. Whereas if you look at the digital inclusion benchmark, I mean, the top companies there are ones that have been around since almost before the internet. And, I think this aging has something to do with the performance. So hopefully, as these companies go public, they're going to be exposed to a wider set of stakeholders, and they'll start to change. Particularly since there's a lot of active investors out there that care about these ESG issues, and now that they're public, they're going to have to address the concerns of these active investors, as well as their other shareholders that are concerned about ESG issues.
Thanks, Michael. I see that one of the participants, Bertha Cooper Rousseau, is unmuted. Bertha, do you want to come in and share your thoughts or ask a question? Please feel free to do so. If anyone else also wants to talk, then also feel free to ask your questions and comments, and we want to be able to share as much as possible about this very detailed understanding and insights of how e-commerce companies are really contributing or or maybe should contribute more towards ensuring that data and digitalization supports development, especially across the global south, which is what UNCTAD's mission is really all about. I also have with me some other colleagues from our team. Very happy to have with us Samantha Indiwalana, who is one of our research analysts. And Samantha has engaged very closely with various companies in the benchmark, and perhaps can also share some thoughts that she learned from talking to companies about how to improve their performance. And we also have Nicholas, who is managing our stakeholder engagements. And I would also invite Nicholas, perhaps, all my colleagues to reflect on the question of, but what can we do? What can be done to improve the performance of e-commerce companies? What can we do as civil society? What can we do as investors? What can we do as governments? And how can we put these efforts together? So Sam and Nicholas, feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Lourdes. One learning that really sticks out to me from all the engagement we've had with companies is that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So I think often companies will go through a benchmark cycle and might look at their results and feel overwhelmed or feel confused about where to start. For example, in some countries, the regulation might not be there yet. And so they aren't sure where to begin, who to look to. And a key finding from the benchmark and from engaging with other companies that are at a more developed stage is that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. It's okay to piggyback on legislation that might already be there and take your learnings and experience from that. So for example, when Michael spoke about GDPR being in place in Europe, that's a data protection policy in Europe, which is quite stringent, and other countries might not have that same policy. You as an e-commerce company can learn from that existing policy and take those learnings and use that to formulate the privacy policy, your group-wide privacy policy. And it doesn't only stop there. You can take the learnings from that policy and implement them in other areas within your organization. For example, if you're thinking about AI ethics principles, privacy is something that comes in there again. So it's not to be scared or overwhelmed, but look at everything that's already there and think about what you have within your organization and where to borrow from existing policy or to learn from other companies.
Thanks, Sam. So basically what you're saying is that even though your country, if you're an e-commerce company operating in a country where the legislation is really not in place yet or not really as solid yet, that there's really no need to see that as a barrier, as a reason to hold you back. That in fact there is a wealth of global best practices that are available from other legislation and from other companies themselves. Because there were, and in our experience and what we observed, there were companies who are ahead of the legislative curve, shall we say. They already put the best practices in place before the regulation. So that made it very easy for them to adopt and to already foresee the risk and challenges ahead. So then the companies can tap into that network and just use those best practices as well. And that's what we are seeing, and that's the positive thing. Thanks. And Nicholas, did you have any thoughts on how we can actually use this data to act on it and to ensure that maybe next year when we publish another ranking and scoring of the companies, we will see much greater improvement across e-commerce companies themselves?
Thank you, Lourdes. I think that's a great question. And in terms of going forward, really, we aim to encourage companies to improve on their performance on various issues that are looked at by the benchmark. And I think in terms of going forward, it's very important for, global stakeholders to come together to work towards addressing issues around data protection and cybersecurity. And one of these ways is through, acting collectively. So what we are doing as WBA, as part of these efforts, is we are in the process of setting up a collective impact coalition for digital inclusion. And this coalition will look at some of the key findings highlighted by our benchmark and designing ways of collaborating with stakeholders from investors to the civil society, think tank groups, and members from the academia to work together to design actions on how we can work together to address some of these issues. So we really invite everyone to come join us, work with us through the Collective Impact Coalition for Digital Inclusion, so that we can discuss and deliberate on how we are going to address some of these issues, because issues around cybersecurity and data protection affects everyone. Looking at, the fast adoption of things to do with artificial intelligence and machine learning in various sectors, from health to food sector to the digital sector to the transport sector. So it's really important that we work together as stakeholders, and we will be sharing more details in the chats on how you can reach us so that we can engage.
Definitely. Thanks, Nicholas. I encourage everyone who is here to get in touch with us, and especially Nicholas, to ask how you can contribute. There are already a lot of exciting actions coming up, and that's very positive. What we are getting is really there's a lot of investor attention around these topics, and in particular, we will be publishing soon a public investor statement on ethical AI. So the world's largest institutional investors are committed to looking at this topic and embracing it as an important investment theme. And the coalition is an opportunity for, if you come from different sectors, whether you're a think tank, an academic representative, a civil society, an international organization, you can also, or an investor, then you can work with each other. And it's a very unique kind of coordinated coalition. So feel free to reach out if you want to know more and join us. But going back to the data, Michael, to Michael Minguez, I think there's an elephant in the room that maybe we have forgotten to ask about. What about the gig economy platforms? Like if you are a ride sharing platform, or if you are a delivery platform, how does that work in terms of other issues? I mean, is it just data governance and ethics? So the question is really, we've highlighted data governance and ethics, we've highlighted privacy, we've highlighted cybersecurity, we've highlighted the importance of committing to ethical AI as important ways to build trust, make the digital transformation really trustworthy and inclusive. But are there other issues, and how are we addressing that in our work? Michael?
Thanks, Lourdes. Yeah. As mentioned, you also just said it, but for instance, the food delivery and ride hailing companies have this particular challenge that their drivers aren't considered employees, and so should they be? Traditionally, you think of a company's supply chain as the people that are providing you with goods that you need to operate your business, or if you're a hardware company, assembling your products. But now you have this case of ride hailing and food delivery, that these are really their suppliers, but they're treated in a different way than the sort of traditional suppliers, because they're human beings. And we do have in our core social benchmark indicators to assess a company's labor practices, but they apply to its own employees. So the practices then that these platforms have kind of fall under the cracks. And but there's a UK NGO whose name escapes me, but it's in our insights report. But they've actually set up a specific benchmark addressed at platform companies and in these areas that are different about them, like how do they treat their labor, do they pay them a living wage, and so on. But certainly it's forced, I think, human rights activists and others to rethink some of the traditional indicators they've been using to assess companies to deal with these new ways of doing business. A related issue is taxes, because a lot of these platforms, particularly the ones with a regional or global reach, they don't have to be physically present in a country, but they can still be selling to that country and or having other services. But some of you may know that the OECD and the Group of 20, they recently adopted a new international tax treaty that all companies will have to pay a minimum tax, and they will have to pay taxes in the countries where they're operating virtually. So that's a good step forward. But I think that touches on what I've noticed with the benchmark is that there's some companies that always want to do the best. So if they have a privacy policy, then it's the same for users all over the world at the highest possible stringent standards. And other companies seem to want to do the minimum, whatever they can get away with, where there's no government regulation. And finding ways to change company behavior to try to always do the best instead of the minimum requirement, I think is key. And some of it, I think can just be reputational risk, that if you highlight, well, these companies are performing poorly, that if that comes to the attention of the CAO, that hopefully he or she will think, okay, well, let's do better in these areas.
Thanks, Michael. Which leads me to reflect, actually, because the benchmark is very useful in the sense that it allows the industry, the digital sector, to try to regulate themselves, to show good intent that they want to improve their performance and their practices. But in some cases, we are seeing progress that's really rather slow. So for example, could you take us through the progress on ethical AI commitments, for example, or on ethical research and development? What have we been seeing there on the level of progress, and what might that imply for public policy or for government regulation?
There's hardly any progress. So I mean, we've had 2 cycles of the benchmark, and the second year there was only one more company that had an AI policy. So at that rate, it will take years. And I think there's this irony here that there's a lack of government regulation in many areas, such as AI, and the tech companies always push back against government regulation, or they say, oh yeah, the reason we don't have this is because there's no government regulation. And then when the government wants to make regulation, they try to water it down. So I think like in the EU, the GDPR is quite strong, and other governments maybe need to be stronger in the kinds of regulations they adopt without hindering innovation. But AI is a key area where, again, there's very few national regulations, and therefore it makes it even more critical for companies themselves to let us know what they're doing and what kind of ethical guidelines are there. And in the government regulation is, again, it's quite interesting if you look at the Insights report in the section on core social indicators. The biggest lobbyists in the world in both North America and in Europe are tech companies. I mean, they spend a fortune on trying to influence legislation. So that's something that needs to be dealt with, and to make sure that when governments are making regulations, they're also taking into account the views of other stakeholders such as the public and civil society.
And the interesting thing is that we've also learned, right, Michael, that if the company already has best practices in place, then they're actually in a much stronger position to participate in the conversation around shaping the regulation, because they already have examples of how they're doing it right, and therefore what guidance is needed, and where to set the ceiling or the red lines for industry. So it's also quite a, it's not necessarily a good strategy in the sense to be continually lobbying against or watering down regulation, but also to already anticipate. And that's actually the surprising thing that we're seeing across our data, because even if for example, AI regulations are already in the horizon, we know in Europe it's already in the making, and we expect that in just a couple of years to be in place, and not just there, but in countries like Brazil or even China, and perhaps in North America soon, and other different countries of Asia. So it's surprising that the movement is quite slow. So we really hope, and we're excited, and we ask you all to watch out for the results next year, and we hope that next year we can see a lot more companies who are now demonstrating their commitments to apply principles of ethical AI. There's already so much out there. There are so many different principles. It's like you have a menu of options as a company. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can, of course, remember that privacy and cybersecurity are key to that, as well as along with fairness and transparency and accountability and all these human-centeredness and all these wonderful principles that you can pick and choose from. But the important thing is to be committed, to start with that commitment, to say that you would like to pay attention, and that at the highest level of the company there is that commitment. So I think it's very useful for regulators and legislators to pay attention to these numbers, and because it really speaks to the fact that that is where they could probably move things along a lot faster and a lot stronger. And we foresee a scramble, really. It's similar to GDPR, and there will be a scramble in the next couple of years to comply. So and that's a bit sad, because you can always anticipate it coming. But the great thing is, as we've said, there's a lot of interest and attention from our investor allies and stakeholders, from our co-leads, for example, Fidelity International, who is present in emerging markets. We have Boston Common, we have Aviva Investors, a lot of other large investor names, Morgan Stanley, even HSBC Assets. They're all interested in ethical AI and are looking to actively pay attention to this issue on the performance of their companies in their portfolio. But
if I can, Lourdes,
yeah, sure.
I just want to also point out some of the AI concerns, particularly related to e-commerce companies. They make extensive use of data to shape your purchasing. All kinds of, if you go on an e-commerce site, they know everything you've bought. They try to influence you through reviews. They want to tell you to buy this or buy that because it's related to what they already know about you. And that can be misused, as well as taking away, from your own autonomy. Another big concern now is the possibility for price discrimination. This is particularly the case on a lot of travel sites that, by looking at your profile and the kinds of things you've ordered, or even the rate at which you're interacting with the service, there's a risk that there will be a lot more discrimination. Somebody will be charged one price based on their reaction, and somebody else will be charged something else, and you'll never know what the real price is to say, fly to Europe, where you'll get, depending on how what they know about you, you'll be charged a different price than somebody else, and that is really concerning. And another area is that most of the e-commerce companies are also heavily involved in finance. Either they have their own financial arm, digital finance, and so on. And there've been a number of cases of people applying for credit, on the e-commerce site, where depending on their gender, depending on their race, they're discriminated against because there's bias built into these AI algorithms. So that makes it really critical, again, for companies to let the public know how they're using AI, what principles they follow, and how it's being operationalized. Otherwise, we really risk a world where we have, little choice, and we'll be subject to a lot more manipulation.
That's really great insights, Michael. I mean, personally myself, I can afford to actually use a lot more of these online platforms or buy a lot more smart devices, but I stopped myself because of a concern around trust. So the trust issue is really very important if we want people to be on board for digitalization and digital transformation. And I think this brings us to, and I will throw these thoughts and ask for your what you think as well from you and Samantha and Nicholas. The UNCTAD's mission, and we are very pleased to be here and invited by UNCTAD to join the e-commerce week, is to maximize the trade, investment, and development opportunities of developing countries, and to assist them in their efforts to integrate into the world economy on an equitable basis. So I think our discussion here really speaks to that mission. What am I talking about? If we go back to our discussion on ethical AI, there are so many risks and harms. And one of the societal risks and harms that we are, I think, not discussing enough of is the impact, the job impact, job displacement impacts of AI and automation. And what are the implications of that for the ability of poor countries to develop? When you've kicked out the ladder, you don't have the usual industrialization route where you make use of your cheap labor in the beginning and you move up the value chain. With massive automation, that's not going to be an option anymore. So how do we deal with that? What are your thoughts on that, Michael? At least on the responsibilities. Should that be a responsibility for the companies to reflect on as well? Is that something they can do, or not really? Because that's part of the raison d'etre for doing business, that the automation is what you do to do business, and then who will be responsible for mitigating these effects to ensure that we don't have a deeply divided world of rich and poor countries?
Yeah, but the problem is it's not clear if that's an ethical issue. In the same sense of ethical idea, the AI being making sure your routines are fair and transparent, but more of a societal issue that goes back for centuries, right? That with every new invention, jobs are going to be displaced, and then you have the one side that always says, "Oh yes, but there'll be new jobs created here and there and somewhere else." but I think it's more of a societal government issue. Have we reached the point now where through automation, through self-driving cars, through robots, at some point, all the warehousing jobs are going to disappear, all the delivery jobs will disappear. And what will you do with these millions of people that somewhat low skilled? It's not clear to me that, oh yeah, there's going to be a need for thousands of software designers or wherever else the new jobs are. But yeah, again, I think, businesses just go by their business model of trying to, reduce cost in whatever way possible. And that, dealing with employment fallout from that is something, governments need to really take seriously and figure out, how they can balance the risk now from all these new technologies.
And I guess there will be two parts of that. Then the fora like UNCTAD's e-commerce week becomes really important. These kinds of things are then discussed. And the other thing is that if we can talk about a just climate transition, we can also talk about a just digital transformation, in a sense that, mitigates the impacts of the displacement to come, because there's a lot of scientific and scholarly consensus that this displacement will be happening, and that it's not necessarily similar to other technological revolutions in the past. It will be a form of permanent displacement. So that's actually, maybe that's what we should start thinking about, how to make the digital transformation not only inclusive and trustworthy, but also just. And we invite everyone to participate in that discussion, talk to us. The digital inclusion benchmark is it's a living thing. It's not a methodology that's set in stone. So we will at some point review how that can be evolved to better reflect the concerns, our global concerns as it evolves. So feel free to reach out to us and express your views. We have a few more minutes, and if any of you are really interested and aching to say something, we've all enabled you to be able to talk. So you just need to be unmuted, and you're good to go. So please feel free to do so. I would say don't be shy, but I would understand that it can be quite confronting to have to try to say something live. But again, we're here at your disposal. Our door is open. We're always willing to collaborate with different organizations across the world. Our Raison d'Être as a nonprofit global initiative is SDG 17. We are here for the partnership for the goals. So to us, that is really what works. If we all partner together, whether we are investors, government, civil society, think tanks, and academia and business, if we partner, we can achieve these goals together. So any other thoughts, Michael? Like, if there's some insight, hidden gem, we have a lot of those in the insights report. So again, I really encourage all of you to download it, to share it, to read it, to cite it, and use it in your own work. And also all the data, the rich data that we put out there is for free. It's a public good. And we encourage you to use that. Michael, Samantha, and Nicholas, any last closing thoughts?
Something that's really stuck out to me in the conversation today is the importance of engagement. And so, as G mentioned in the comments, we want companies to be speaking to each other about different topics, about different policies, about what steps they should be taking to start that ethical AI principles, or to put in place some sort of practice. But we don't want the engagement to stop there in a silo with companies just speaking to one another. As the benchmark, we are always here, we're always happy to be part of that engagement, but we also encourage different people within civil society, investors, governments, to always be open and available to take part in these discussions, because it's only through engagement that we're going to be able to move forward and to tackle some of these big questions that Lourdes shared today. So for example, when Michael was speaking about governments playing a role in potential job losses from AI, that's an opportunity for companies to engage with people whose jobs might be lost. They can engage with companies, other digital companies that have already gone through that process. How did you handle it? What are the best steps that we as an e-commerce company could take? Yes, e-commerce is a bit different from the platform industry or from another industry, but there's still learnings to be taken and to be had from that. So engagement is quite important.
Very well said, Sam. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Sam, what you said is an excellent point. And so one of the findings that I've discovered is that apart from the mobile industry, which has the GSMA, which is a really strong industry body, almost every mobile operator is part of it, there doesn't exist something similar for other industries within digital, or let alone a global kind of industry trade group. And GSMA is quite active in every major issue, from climate change to AI to child online protection and so on. And they kind of then set a position for the industry that the other mobile operators can discuss and agree on. But that's completely lacking, as I said, for all the other industries. So I don't know, you need, when we talk about companies engaging with each other, so many of them seem to be hyper competitive and going and doing their own thing, that whether if there was some way, there's some kind of an industry organization that lets them participate. Even in the e-commerce space, there's some regional e-commerce associations, but there's no sort of global trade association that addresses these ESG issues, not about how to make more money from e-commerce or lobby governments to weaken regulations, but actually that then would preach good things and say, companies, let's unite on this, let's have better AI principles. So I think that's what's really lacking is strong industry, forward-thinking trade associations.
That's true, but there is at least some good signs through the community of practice peer learning sessions that we facilitate ourselves around the digital inclusion benchmark results. We are seeing that there's some kind of cross-fertilization now. So the e-commerce companies are listening to the experiences of older telcos who have some of these policies in place, and you can learn from other industries as well. So I think that's actually a very exciting development to see. I think we will close with that thought, with that positive note. And again, we always like to close with a call to action. We invite all of you to be in touch. Check out Insights report, check out the benchmark rank and scores and all the data that we put out there. And my colleague Nicholas has shared it wonderfully with all of you in the chat. So feel free to be in touch with Nicholas as well, especially if you want to join the coalition, the Collective Impact Coalition on Digital Inclusion. Please be in touch. Let's work together. That's what we are here for. Let's use the data truly for good and use it to really meet the needs of data and digitalization for development. So thank you everyone for being here. We will be sharing this in our social media channels for those who have not attended. So feel free to check it out later. Thank you. Bye.